Hello and welcome to an episode of Nasdaq Spotlight. I'm your host, Leanne Alfaro, supervising producer here at the Nasdaq, and joining me today to talk a little bit about how businesses, government, and futurists like herself work with uncertainty in these unprecedented times is Amy Webb. She's CEO of Future Today Institute and professor at NYU Stern School of Business. Amy, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, of course.
So could you start by telling me a little bit about how we currently have observed the government, businesses kind of approach uncertainty amid the COVID-19 crisis?
Sure. So under normal circumstances, the way that people think about the future, especially in the markets and in business and in tech, is that they try to build models. And those models, are predicated on typically data that people have access to and those areas over which they have total control. We're dealing with a situation right now where no one entity has 100% of the control, which means that there's a sort of soul-crushing amount of uncertainty. And my observation has been that the attempts, the sentiment is really, how can we try to control this situation? And in reality, there's no real way to control what's happening because it's not isolated to a single state or a single company or an industry sector. This is a global pandemic. I liken this to driving a car on a slippery road. A lot of people have been behind the wheel and suddenly hit ice. Anybody who has driven on ice knows that when you start to slip, you should never slam your foot on the brakes, right? Slamming the foot on the brakes is a great way to make sure that you have an accident. But why do we do that? The reason is because in our heads, we think if we slam down on the brakes, the car will stop moving. The only way that that works is if we're in control of every single variable. But when you're on a slippery road, right, you don't necessarily control what the pavement is, what the ice layer is, even the pressure in all of your tires. So instead of slamming on the brakes, what you're supposed to do is steer into the slide, and that feels uncomfortable. But you kind of have to do that while keeping your eye on the road in front of you. That's a wonderful an analogy to sort of apply to right now, which is you can't slam on your brakes and hope that somehow we're all going to return to normal. We should stop asking questions about what the new normal is and when we'll get there. And most importantly, we have to sort of focus on what's happening in the present while keeping our eye on the road in front of us. And what that really means is, being willing to steer into the slide, leaning into uncertainty rather than trying to control everything that happens. And for CEOs, and for investors, I know that that's a super difficult pill to swallow, but that is where we are right now.
And so you're talking about external uncertainties here. So we're looking at our first kind of visualization that you've presented us with. And in this particular example, we have economic, social, technological, regulatory, politics. When dealing with all of these external uncertainties, how can we use an approach that a futurist might use to address the unknown and to prepare for it?
Right. So when most companies and most leaders are thinking about the future, they tend to think very narrowly. So they're looking at their immediate competition, they're looking at their industry segments. What they tend not to do is look for those factors outside or adjacent to their everyday work to understand what might influence the future. So in any circumstance, whenever, I'm a quantitative futurist, I use data and try to model out where we see signals and trends, longitudinal trends, and what that implies for the future. Anytime that we are building out scenarios, we are always looking at external uncertainties that tend to fall into these categories. So, where do we see shifts and changes in regulation? Where are there tech changes, technological changes on the horizon? Where do we see economic forces entering into the picture, and what are the social movements and changes that are afoot? Every company, when they're thinking about their future, has to also incorporate these areas that are external, because these are areas over which no one entity has control. So when we are trying to think through plausible scenarios for the future, before we start writing those out, we start here. And what we say is, let's think of all the different social uncertainties, all of the different technological ones, and let's express them as opposites. So, for example, a technological uncertainty might be sometime in the next year, we have widespread home-based diagnostic testing for the coronavirus,
Mhm.
or we have to continue to go to a lab. On the social side, we could say prolonged quarantines lead to greater social unrest or does not lead to social unrest. For economics, we might say that our current workforce will continue to contract, meaning we'll have greater unemployment, or we will start to see things swing in the other direction and we'll have less unemployment. So we would go through and try to come up with as many of these as we possibly can. And then we would select 2 at random. And there would be, many others. You might have categories that are specific to your field or industry. But basically, you select 2, put them together on an XY axis, and say, well, what would happen if, we've got the workforce shrinks, contracts, the labor force does not. And, we have, the increased, many more autonomous robots able to do work at scale, or we don't have AI in the cloud and, at scale. But basically you match them together. And that then allows you to say, well, if these 2 things that we have a lot of uncertainty about were to happen at the same time, right, then what? This is an activity called the axes of uncertainty, and it results in many different nuggets of plausible future states, plausible scenarios. These are not full-blown scenarios that you could build strategy on. This is the beginning of the process, but it's a critically important beginning of the process because when companies, when leaders, when government entities, when they're thinking about the future, most of us tend to take our signals from the present day and just amplify them. So like a lot of what I'm hearing right now is, well, we'll all work from home in perpetuity, right? Or we'll have much more, having school at home, or there will never be conferences again. All business travel will cease and will Zoom forever.
And
As a
it sounds
futurist,
like these possibilities would sit somewhere on these axes of uncertainty, right?
Well, what I would say is the axes are meant to ask you, to challenge you to think much more broadly. As a
Right.
futurist,
You
I
get
would
many more
always,
possibilities.
right. So I would say, what would it take for X to be Y? What would it take for us to cancel all of our conferences and to, Zoom in perpetuity? Well, it would take a lot, right? And also, aren't there other plausible outcomes for the future that maybe we just haven't thought of yet? So if you force yourself to think much more broadly using the axes of uncertainty, that's where you start to get to true insights about how things could pan out. And some of them can be good. Some of them, can potentially mean existential risk.
Right. And I mean, as you said, this is an extremely uncomfortable exercise, I'm sure, especially amid, a situation where there's crisis already, there's risks already that are presented every day. So walk me through this example right here. You've already touched on something a little bit similar to this, but we're looking at these axes of uncertainties here. We have existential risk moving in clockwise order, near-term opportunity, long-term risk.
Right. So again, the point of this is not to predict a future. My job as a futurist is not to make predictions. It's to create a state of readiness. So the job is about preparation, not prediction. And what's so cool about the axes of uncertainty is it allows you to sort of see around corners in advance. And if what you see there presents itself as existential risk or potentially an opportunity, it means there's an action you can take in the present. So this is just one example where we, on the y-axis, we're saying COVID-19 leads to a reduction in the labor supply. We've certainly seen that so far. Or the alternative is COVID-19 does not lead to a reduction in the labor supply. On the x-axis, we're talking about cloud-based robotics and artificial intelligence. So Cloud-based robotics can be used at scale in 2020. For those of you who follow Amazon and Boston Dynamics and all the cool, interesting robotics companies and all the work that's happening, one of the new things this year is being able to access robots from, and having them collaborate together, share data, and basically it's a cloud-based system versus a much more clunky system where you have to be on site and operate them. So it's a cool thing that's happening. But the question that we're asking is, they can be used at scale in 2020, or they're basically just tested. And what we do is now we've got this 2x2 matrix, and we say, well, if these two things happen, what's the outcome? And what we're trying to get at here are downstream implications. So if we have a reduction in the labor supply and cloud robotics are only tested this year, that's a near-term opportunity. Then COVID-19 reveals new insights for workforce automation, but it gives us some time to prepare for economic disruption. If we have a continued prolonged reduction in the labor supply, and cloud-based robotics can be used at scale sometime this year, then we're in a situation where, because of this pandemic, we have faster workforce automation and much more technological unemployment than we would have had otherwise. So we have a sharp reduction in jobs, which causes significantly more economic stress than anticipated, and that would be an existential risk. So every time you do this, you're going to wind up with 4 plausible scenarios for the future, and your job is to label them as something that's an opportunity, something that's a risk, something that's potentially an existential risk. And once you've done that, it doesn't mean that this is the only thing that comes true. This is helping us to generate some thoughts on what could happen using a much, much wider aperture than we would have otherwise. Now it's your job to do some investigation. Well, what would this mean for your company, right? What would it mean if we have faster workforce automation, a sharper reduction in jobs, and many more, cloud-based robotic systems that can automate work that's being done by people today? What does that mean to your company? And you have to figure that out now and to start factoring that into your strategic planning.
Now certainly seems like a great time to approach this kind of axis of uncertainty as we begin to think about what it means to reopen the country and what it means to go to a new normal, assuming that we won't all be going in one wave. So I'm sure this will be very helpful.
Yeah, and I would just say, I think the one terrific thing about, I have several dozen different frameworks and tools that we use to do our work in strategic foresight. One of the things that I think the axis of uncertainty reveals is, or questions, is the sense of normal. People keep asking, what is our new normal? And I think what they're really asking is, when are we going to not have change coming at us from every single direction, every single day? And the answer to that question is, I don't know. So this is another opportunity to, again, steer into the slide. We're all in a car. We're all slipping and sliding around on ice. We have to keep our eyes on the road ahead and to really think through, what are the downstream implications of the decisions that we're making? How can we slow down this process when everything feels so immediate and acute? And how can we generate opportunities to turn this dystopian scenario that we are currently living in into an opportunity to create a better tomorrow?
Amy, thank you so much for your time. I think that, this is definitely a really important exercise, and change seems to be perpetual right now. So it's something that we definitely need to become a little bit more comfortable with, be uncomfortable, and, as you say, steering into the slide. That was Amy Webb. She is CEO of Future Today Institute, professor at NYU Stern School of Business. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Nasdaq Spotlight.